Rewind, Your Week in Review is sponsored by the Wisconsin Realtors Association, bringing Wisconsin communities to life with great homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. The Wisconsin Realtors Association, the voice of real estate.
This week's edition of Rewind, Your Week in Review.
Here's the bottom line, folks. We're losing more than 2 dairy farms a day.
Governor Tony Evers calls a special session to help farmers and the state's troubled agribusinesses. Republicans say, show us the details. Evers also promises to form a People's Maps advisory panel to recommend the fairest possible redistricting map in 2021.
We all want clean drinking water.
The legislature puts on Evers' desk a ban on firefighting equipment with a dangerous PFAS compound. And finally, the Democratic senator who led all other Democratic senators to Illinois to try and stop Act 10 in 2011 is retiring. All this and much more in the January 24 edition of Rewind, Your Week in Review. I'm Steve Walders.
I'm Scott Bauer.
Thanks, Scott, for filling in for JR. He's got some family time. Busy week in the Capitol?
Sure was.
Okay, let's talk about first, of course, the governor's State of the State speech. Before we listen to this, a little bit of the speech, were you surprised at the emphasis he put on ag and farm issues?
Not really surprised. It was a surprise in that he hadn't foreshadowed that before the speech, and so none of us knew that those proposals were going to be in there. So that was a newsy surprise in a State of the State. But picking that as an issue and that as a focus, maybe not so much surprised. It's something that he had in his budget. It's obviously an issue for the state right now, and it seems to be one that would be a popular one for him to take on.
And of course, the Repub said, about time you got around to some ag issues, Governor Evers.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's listen to a segment of the governor's speech on ag issues and a response from Senator Fitzgerald.
We have leaned on farmers and their families. We have depended on their dedication, and we relied on their resilience. We have not forgotten those who have shared the harvest and bounty, feeding our families, our communities, and our state. I'm announcing a 3-pronged plan to start addressing these challenges. First, tonight, I'm calling a special session of the legislature next week to take up legislation to invest in our farmers, agriculture industries, and our rural communities. The package of bills we'll announce tomorrow includes a bill creating the Wisconsin Initiative for Dairy Exports. So we're going to set a goal of increasing Wisconsin's dairy exports by 20% of the United States milk supply by the year 2024. Our mental health program will assist farmers in accessing mental health support. They will also help coordinate local and regional peer support programming and provide confidential one-on-one counseling and assistance to our farmers. I am also announcing that I'll be working with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation to establish the Office of Rural Prosperity. The office will provide a one-stop shop for the folks to navigate state programs and the resources that are available that are tailored to rural communities, businesses, and workers.
We're all looking for ways to do better when it comes to ag, and there's been a number of proposals by the legislature, but I'm all ears on what the governor has to offer, and I think the legislature should take time to figure out what the special session includes and work on those bills.
Scott, let's look at 3 things. The governor mentioned them, but let's talk about them a little bit. First of all, he wants to dramatically boost the amount of Wisconsin ag exports, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there was some confusion on the numbers. Did you understand them? I'm not sure I do.
Not sure I quite understand it, but the bottom line is right. He wants to export more. He wants farmers to diversify. Find ways to incentivize them to find other markets, other products for what they're producing now. Mental health, increase that. He calls it a 3-pronged approach, creating this blue ribbon commission on rural prosperity. These are all things that are getting at, in some ways, what's going on in rural Wisconsin. Whether they'll have much of an impact or not, whether they'll get approved or not, we don't know. But at least it's an attempt to get at, what has been a very difficult decade.
And yesterday, the governor's office released a price tag on these things, $8.5 million.
$8.5 million for a package of, I believe, 8 bills.
8 bills.
That we're looking at. He formally called the special session yesterday and asked the legislature to come in on Tuesday. Through their arcane process, they will technically gavel in on that session, but they will not be meeting on the floor.
Right.
These bills have to be circulated, introduced. Hearings have to be held, but the clock is ticking on the legislature being in session for the year, believe it or not, even though we're here on January 24th.
Yeah, let's go back. He would put a new emphasis on mental health resources, but there's been some bickering between the R's and the D's on this. Just what do you recall on that?
It's one of those issues that you would think people would find agreement on, and yet they're fighting over. They have fought in the past over how much to spend on these things, and part of that was in the air with the Ag Secretary Brad Pfaff being fired by the Senate because he was highly critical of the legislature for not releasing money for farmer mental health programs. So the governor's proposal, deals with just providing more outlets for farmers to get the services they may need, as we're seeing an increase in suicides as farms go under.
And then finally, can there be any more generic title of a Blue Ribbon Commission on Rural Prosperity?
Right. Sounds good.
Yeah, it does.
Right. Sign me up. I think that's, again, remains to be seen who will be on that, what they will produce. There is a history in Wisconsin of these commissions being formed and coming up with proposals that are seriously considered and that do chart the future in certain ways. Whether this becomes that or becomes more of a political talking point remains to be seen.
And I'm also curious, remember in the last budget, there's, let me get the number right, $7.8 million for a dairy innovation hub for UW-Madison, Platteville, and River Falls. I'm not sure that we know how all this is going to be coordinated yet.
Yeah, I mean, we've known about these proposals, well, for 2 days. Some of them were left over from the budget, but there's a lot of, fleshing out that needs to happen and that will happen here as this moves forward.
Right, and Majority Leader Stanicki in an interview yesterday told me, we haven't seen these bills. And so it was news to him. Okay, new topic. The governor got into the redistricting issue, which you and I didn't know if he'd go there because he hammered that so much last year without any success. But let's listen to what he said, because there's a new phrase in the Capitol, a People's Maps Commission. Please.
So tonight, as promised, I am bringing the fight for nonpartisan redistricting to the legislature. In the coming days, I will be signing an executive order to create a nonpartisan redistricting commission who will draw the people's maps. Our nonpartisan redistricting commission will consist of the people of our state, not the elected officials, not lobbyists, not high-paid consultants. The People's Map Commission will visit every congressional district, hear directly from folks across our state, and draw fair, impartial maps for the legislature to take up next year.
I think the governor just proposed something that's completely unconstitutional. It's still a responsibility of the legislature to draw the maps every 10 years based on the census, and we should have more information by the census begins on 1 April. It'll take a year to complete, and the legislature has to draw those maps whether he likes it or not. That's where we're at. What he proposed tonight was, kind of taking it on the road and I guess drumming up support, but at the end of the day, it's the legislature's responsibility to draw those maps.
Now, you and I heard the cheering on the part of Democrats when he announced the People's Maps Commission, but as Senator Fitzgerald said, you begin the process April 1, then a year later, then you compile. Was this just a symbolic gesture?
There's a lot of different things going on here. When the Republicans say this is unconstitutional, what they're referring to is the governor presenting them with maps and saying, you've got to take these maps and pass these. The Constitution gives the legislature the power to draw the maps. That is true. Yeah. What the governor is doing is creating a commission that will draw maps, that will go through a very public process to contrast with what may happen in the legislature. If you remember last time around, it was a very secretive process. Republicans drawing the maps.
Lawmakers had to take an oath. You will not
take
talk
an
about
oath.
what you
No
see
one
here.
knew what the maps looked like until just before they were being voted on.
Right.
And this was all part of the legal battle, and a lot of details came out during that about how secretive it was.
Legal bills you and I paid for.
Legal bills we paid for. Judges reprimanding lawmakers over the process. That whole thing. So what the governor's doing here is creating a very public process to create very public maps that he will put forward and say, these are maps that we ought to consider. These are nonpartisan, although Republicans take issue with that characterization. But at the end of the day, what we'll have is a contrast to what the legislature puts forward, which then may become important in what is expected to be a legal fight over the maps. the legislature passes because the governor has the veto authority over those maps.
And this commission will not be completely unlike Iowa. In Iowa, you have a nonpartisan commission which draws, and it has statutory authority, and it refers to the legislature, which can go up or down, and then I think if they reject the second one, it has to be changed.
There is no statutory authority given to this commission, given that it's created under an executive order.
And we're talking about something that's more than a year out.
Correct.
Right.
And I can't remember if it was Speaker Voss or Majority Leader Fitzgerald, but one of the Republican leaders said, we will look at these maps just like anybody sitting at home on their computer can draw a map. So it's very dismissive of the weight that this will be given when they go through their process. Okay.
Topic 3, there was a report yesterday that tax collections will be $818 million higher by mid-2021. $409 million of that, must go to the rainy day fund, which will exceed $1 billion. That's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
That's new in Wisconsin government. And then Foxconn, I think, was budgeted to get more than $200 million if they met all their hiring targets.
Mm-hmm.
And now Fiscal Bureau says could only be $50 or $75 million.
Correct.
So that would help the bottom line. But now, Scott, what are you hearing in terms of leaders in terms of what to do with this windfall?
Yeah, pretty predictable, drawing of the choices we have here. Republicans calling for tax cuts, specifically in the Senate. They're all behind a property tax cut plan, which we haven't seen yet, but that they're working on. And they made news about that shortly after everyone got their property tax bills in December. So they're working on something property tax related. The Assembly is gung-ho for doing something about lowering debt and possibly cutting taxes.
And Assembly Speaker Voss says, read my lips, no new spending.
Correct.
Yeah.
And Democrats, somewhat predictably, are talking about, well, let's go back and fill in some of the cuts that UW had and that other priorities, mental health services, things that they think the money ought to be directed toward. So again, we'll have kind of the classic showdown between cutting taxes and spending more money, and with the governor having the, again, veto authority over whatever the legislature does.
Bottom line, don't you think the legislature will put some type of a tax cut on the governor's desk by the end of the spring session?
It's an election year, Steve, so yes.
Yes. Good answer. Okay, one thing both Assembly and Senate did, new topic, is agree on a ban on PFAs and firefighting foam. The Assembly and Senate voted on that, sent the ban to the governor's desk. The ban comes after high levels of health-threatening PFAs were found in tests around the state, including Starkweather Creek, which feeds into Lake Monona on Madison's east side. But Evers wants the legislature to do more than just this. He proposed in his homework letter that they act on the clear, which is a much broader ban. Is ban the wrong term?
It gives the DNR, it tasks the DNR with doing more to regulate these PFAS.
Right.
The firefighting foam bill that passed was probably the lowest hanging fruit that they could take currently, although Representative Nygren talked about that there is ongoing discussions about doing more on this issue. It's a huge issue for his district in Marinette, and he is talking with Senate Democrats and others about taking another step. We haven't seen what that bill may look like, but I would not be surprised. In fact, I anticipate there to be more on this issue before the session is over.
Okay, thanks. Let's look at what the Senate and the Assembly, did separately. Let's start with the very interesting debate in the Senate on one of the homeless bills passed by the Assembly. Please.
In November, 3 homeless individuals died right here in Wisconsin. We're talking about life and death for some of these individuals who don't have a home to call their own. And I think sometimes we seem to think that the reason that these individuals are homeless is due to some fault of their own. All they have to do is get a job, pay their rent, just like we do every day on a daily basis. We shouldn't be here having the conversation about where this money is going or when it's going to be allotted. The fact is, the money is already allotted.
You know that in 2018, the recipients of the state shelter subsidy grants provided over 606,000 homeless nights. Some people say that these bills, the package, don't do enough, and I agree, they don't do enough. because this is a very complex problem. We've been talking about it. It's a matter of mental health, and we need to address that issue. It's a matter of relationships, that has been said. It's a matter of job skills and education. Many of you have mentioned these. I hope that we can at least pass this today, and we can go on and have this passionate discussion about what we can do later. But let's at least do this today.
The bill that the Senate acted on, $500,000 per year for emergency homeless shelters. That's only one of how many Assembly passed? 8.
Right. It's another one of these fascinating issues where you'd think they'd be in the heat of agreement. These are Republican-authored bills, bipartisan support in the Assembly. This Assembly Majority Leader Steineke, this is his pet project. And yet you've got some senators, Republican senators, who are objecting to spending some of the money.
But we got all this new money, $818.
Well, now we do.
Excuse me.
Right, right. And it's not, in the grand scheme of things, we're talking $6 million, I think, left after they do this. So not a lot of money. And it's not clear if they're going to take up the rest of those bills.
Not clear at all. You and I might privately bet they won't. Okay. The Senate also approved 2 cabinet secretaries, Caleb Frostman as Secretary of the Workforce Development, Joaquin Alturo as the leader of the Housing and Economic Development Authority. But there's an untold story here, Scott, who isn't confirmed.
Right. We still have half a dozen or so of the cabinet secretaries.
Transportation, health, tourism.
Right, who are hanging out there doing their jobs, reporting to work, getting paid, doing everything they would do as if they were confirmed. But they kind of have that sword hanging over them that at any moment they could face the Brad Pfaff treatment of being fired. If the Senate is displeased with what they see. Right, and we have no indication that Senate Majority Leader Fitzgerald is going to schedule any of those confirmation votes. We don't know until the calendars come out for their meeting days. And finally, this is very, very interesting. It's not a high priority, important issue, but the Senate votes to allow people to take selfies in the sanctity of their voting booth showing, look, I voted for candidate X, Y, and Z. Not a huge problem, but it's kind of interesting. It's interesting. You've got some clerks who are not happy with it. Scott McDonald here in Dane County being one of the louder critics saying, look, once you allow this to happen, it opens the door to unions or any other special interest group or employer saying, we want a picture of you with your marked ballots. Proving that you voted for our guy or woman. And so, maybe it's an unfounded fear, maybe not. But I think the feeling was that a lot of people were doing this anyway. And so just to kind of remove any worry that it would be illegal, they pass it. Now it still has to go through the Assembly and the governor. So when I read a summary of this or a news story about it, I think more than 20 states allow these selfies. So it's just interesting. Mm-hmm. But it's not on the governor's desk. I think it still has to go to the Assembly. Okay, now let's take a look at what the state Assembly did. They approved is this the third or fourth package of HOPE agenda bills? We've had a 30 pass already. Okay. And just elements of the ones that passed this week would expand access to Narcan, which reverses, remember, the opioid overdose, protect state employees from discipline for enrolling in opioid addiction to treatment. And one other thing it does, required Medicaid coverage of acupuncture. This is Mr. Nygren, who we're going to hear from, obviously a tragic family incident, but we seem to be making some progress on this because, as we're going to hear from Mr. Nygren, fewer opioid prescriptions. So we continue to move on this issue. Any PSs? No? It's just an issue that has found nearly unanimous support in the legislature. That's a good point. Okay, let's listen to Mr. Nygren talk about the need for these bills that I believe went to the Senate or to the governor. Do you know? Correct, Senate. To the Senate. Thank you.
I stand before you today with 6 more important pieces of legislation that are part of the HOPE agenda. This action will cement Wisconsin as the leader on this issue, which has plagued every state in the nation. It was announced that for the first time since 2015, opioid deaths in Wisconsin are down. While this is positive, the loss of life is too significant. Last year, 838 Wisconsinites died from an opioid overdose. We still have a lot of work to do. Rather than us legislating as a body, insurers in our state, to eliminate prior authorization for medication-assisted treatment, oftentimes a barrier to treatment, the healthcare community the recovery community, insurers in our state came together in agreement that it was the right thing to do.
Scott, this was a story that you wrote this week. The Department of Justice has now, I don't know if they announced it, I think the Cap Times reported it, they're looking into how the National Guard botched or mishandled complaints of sexual assault, sexual harassment. So why don't you walk us through that?
Right. My colleague Todd Richmond has done a lot of reporting on this story, and it's a very important one. It's led to the ouster of Wisconsin National Guard Leader General Don Dunbar, who had survived numerous administrations, both
longest serving
in the country,
yes.
Republican and Democratic administrations. But essentially what you have is the National Guard Bureau looking into allegations here and finding that cases when people reported misconduct, that the investigations were done internally and not following the process they're supposed to follow for how this is to happen. So what we have now...
Was it Cap Times that first reported?
Cap Times reported this latest development,
yes,
which was that the State Department of Justice is contacting victims and saying that DOJ, are reopening these cases to take a look at them. So, and the state DOJ will investigate. So DOJ has not commented.
I was going to ask you, why have they not confirmed that?
My assumption is that they're perhaps still contacting people.
Okay.
I don't know why they haven't confirmed that. I would expect that they would at some point when they're comfortable talking about it. Anytime there's an open investigation, I think you'll find that the investigators are not too keen on talking about what they're up to.
Okay.
But it's an ongoing story. It's far broader than the Wisconsin National Guard. There are Todd has reported on other incidents in the Army Reserves and other military units, very similar to what happened here, where processes were not followed correctly when people reported misconduct.
Okay, and as you said, the National Guard Bureau, that report did force the governor to immediately ask for the resignation of Don Dunbar. Mm-hmm. And I just want to do a PS. Since then, recently, the governor announced a ombudsman for the National Guard.
Yep. Yeah, so that'll be a new position, and he's looking for applicants. I believe he put out the call for applicants to succeed Don Dunbar. So a lot of changes happening over there at the Guard, and we'll see kind of how that plays out.
Yeah, as you said, that's an important story. Now let's get into Senate personnel. A long-serving Senate Democratic former leader, Senator Mark Miller, lives in Monona but represents part of Madison, announced that he's not going to seek re-election. He's 76. Were you surprised?
You know, you're always surprised when somebody finally steps down.
Comes on the eve of Senator Hansen,
right?
Also in his 70s.
Right. Dave Hansen announced his retirement. Dave Hansen's in a potentially a swing district in the Green Bay area.
Yes.
Democrats, he's held it for 20 years. That will be a big fight in the state Senate. Mark Miller's district here in the Madison area, Dane County, solidly Democratic.
He followed Chuck Qualla. Qualla, I think, came to the Senate in '85. Excuse me.
Okay, so yeah, that's a nice bit of history there. And Miller's, the three assembly members are all Democrats who come from that Senate district. So Democrats don't have to worry about losing the seat. But there will be, it looks like there could be a primary fight there. Melissa Sargent was quick to announce that she's running, and just before we came over here today, Gary Hebel says he's not running.
He's not running?
Not running. So you have Jimmy Anderson is the third Democrat he has not said yet what his intentions are.
Aren't you also hearing Kelda's name?
Kelda Roys, who ran for governor, who ran for Congress, who's a former state rep, put her name out there. Or said she's thinking about it. A number of others, I'm sure, are thinking about it. We'll see if Sargent getting in early and starting to get some endorsements out of the gate, whether that will freeze out other Democrats.
Well, let's talk about Miller's lead in the wake of the Act 10 proposal by Governor Walker. Mm-hmm. Early in 2011, Walker took the oath in January, promptly introduced Act 10 to try to buy time. Miller led Senate Democrats is flee too strong a word to Illinois? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep.
Where they were gone, and I think you and I both went to Illinois to interview them. I know WisconsinEye did, but so they come back in triumph. What What are your memories of Senator Miller?
A couple memories come to mind on that. One is the video of the TV crew following the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, Ted Blaisdell, to Mark Miller's house in Monona as he's knocking on the door to see if Mark is there to tell him it's time to come into the Senate
because
session.
of the call of Senate proposal.
Correct. So there was quite a bit of drama with the Republicans, doing it wasn't a call of the House, but whatever the official
procedure that says thou must enter the Senate chamber.
Right, to send poor Ted Blaisdell out to this house.
He's not a sworn law officer.
To knock on the door of Mark Miller, who of course was in Illinois, and everyone knew he was in Illinois. But we had to have this made-for-TV moment, which was replayed over and over again, of Mark Miller not being at home in Monona.
Okay.
The other memory that comes to mind was during the 2 weeks that they were down there in Illinois, they did a lot of media. John Erpenbach was on Comedy Central and national TV, but I remember at one point Mark Miller shooting a video from the hotel. Maybe you remember this. A video shot in the hotel.
They were in two hotels. Go ahead.
Right, one of the hotels where they were staying.
Rockford first.
With flags on the desk and him at a desk reading this paper. It almost looked, some people said it looked like a hostage video of him talking about their demands and, what needs to happen for them to come back. But, as you said, eventually they did come back, and
they came back in a triumph on a Saturday. There was a big...
Yes, outside the Capitol.
Yes.
They were welcomed back as heroes. They didn't stop Act 10 from happening. The vote went forward without them here.
Right.
It became law. So there is that.
Right. Okay. Well, he was elected to the Assembly in 1998, Senate in 2004, Minority Leader, of course, during the Act 10 controversy. He was Air National Guard pilot from 1966 to 1995. And I'm curious, how do you interpret his one of his final statements, Scott? We continue to erode public trust and confidence in our ability to govern ourselves through our democratic institutions. It's time to let younger people come up. How do you see that?
It's an interesting quote, and it's one that you see as older people retire from the legislature. You kind of see this theme emerging. When Mike Ellis left a number of years ago, he had a similar kind of parting note.
That's a good point.
To everyone. And I'd have to go back and look, but I think Dave Hansen had similar feelings. And the average age in the Senate is, I don't know what it is, but it's pretty high, especially among Democrats, I think, right now. So, I think...
Well, Mr. Risser
he skews it. That's true.
92 plus.
I think.
Thank you. Go
93. So I don't know. It's it'll be if Melissa Sargent gets in. I believe she's in her 40s, maybe her 30s. She's definitely a different generation from Mark Miller. Jimmy Anderson is also very young. Yeah. So there's a potential that there's generational shift there for sure.
Right. Mm-hmm. WisconsinEye will certainly be asking for an exit interview with Senator Miller. We've got about 20 seconds. Let's look next Tuesday. Vice President Pence. Yeah. Scheduled to come to the Capitol.
Right.
What's the forum, just briefly, Scott?
It's National School Choice Week, and they'll be celebrating school choice here in Wisconsin, the state where it started, in Milwaukee. Vice President being here will be a big deal.
Yeah, it will be a big deal. Associated Press trying to get a one-on-one with Vice President?
We, like WisconsinEye, will be there.
We'll be there. Well, we've asked. We'll see what happens. I'm Steve Walders.
I'm Scott Bauer.
That's Rewind for January 24th. Scott, thanks for filling in for JR.
You bet.
Thank you.
Rewind, Your Week in Review, is sponsored by the Wisconsin Realtors Association, bringing Wisconsin communities to life with great homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. The Wisconsin Realtors Association, the voice of real estate.